first of all, this is not just about Strawbale building. This is about natural building in general. So my first question is, why build naturally? Why bother? For us, it's obviously saving us a lot of money, right? So that might be one aspect. But an analogy for why to build naturally is, why garden? Why do you guys garden? Do any of you garden? I bet most of you do. Sustainability. Okay. Jonathan, why do you garden?
Because we plant tomatoes.
Because you plant tomatoes. And what do you do with your tomatoes?
Eat them.
Oh, you like to eat. I bet you're not going to eat any Strawbale houses though, right? Oh, okay. Any other reasons for gardening?
Something to do.
Something to do.
Exercise.
Good exercise. Yeah. Right? Good use of your money, right? No chemicals in your food. Do you think that has anything to do with any similarities to building naturally? We know that conventional building materials have chemicals in them, right? We don't always know what chemicals because they don't usually label their materials,
The
right?
same standards that say your food is safe also say your building materials are safe.
Right. So,
Same people.
you know, I realize that conventional building is sometimes the only way people can build. Like if they're not able physically themselves to do the building and they have to hire somebody, it's sometimes hard to find somebody that'll build naturally for you because it's not a really, well-known thing. But if you're going to build your own house, you might want to consider using at least some natural materials, maybe more than you do the conventional materials. There's still, obviously there's conventional materials that are healthy, like a metal roof. You're not going to get any off-gassing or VOCs. Have you guys heard of VOCs? Volatile organic compounds. That's what the chemicals put off. They put off, toxins into the air. So if you do build conventionally, it's a good idea to air out your house for a period of time before you live in it, All right, so when you garden, you save money and you are able to produce food more healthfully, right? When
you get free exercise.
And you get free exercise. Same when you build naturally.
And
okay?
spiritually, you learn lessons that you don't learn otherwise.
That's true, right? It's also better for the environment, okay? Because if you're building with natural materials, you're not having to buy stuff that's been shipped halfway across the country, right? That's uses a lot of gas and things that, right, it's not so good for the environment. And also, we don't know we don't know when the lots of hard times are coming on this world, but there may be sometime in the future when a knowledge of these types of building methods would be very useful for you because, if you're kicked out of your house for some reason, even though you may not want to build a really big house, you might want to know how to use simple natural methods in order to build something small and quick just to survive with. And these principles can certainly be used for that as well. Not everybody, is going to build a big house with natural materials, but it's good to know how to build something, right? So it can help you to care for your family in times of economic crisis. Okay. And also, building naturally makes it a lot easier to bring a lot of natural beauty into your home. And this is not our house. We're doing a lot of natural stuff in our house. Ours is maybe a little bit more rustic than some of this stuff, but it's a really good way to bring a natural and inviting, and it's also a good way to be creative. Brian's an artist. He loves to do creative stuff, so it fits very well with him. It's also easy for the do-it-yourselfer. You don't have to have a lot of experience in building when you do natural building. We know because we didn't have a lot of experience. We've learned a lot along the way, I can tell you that. But now that we're working on the inside, Brian gets to do a lot more of the creative stuff, and I think he likes that a lot. I'm not so much the creative person, but I like the look. So I'm going to start with a short history of the Strawbale house movement, okay? Or actually before the movement, actually. Throughout ancient times and even nowadays, all throughout the world, people have built with natural materials. It's more common to build with natural materials on a worldwide scale. Here in America and maybe some places in Europe, it's become more, common to buy your building materials, but all over the world, people have used adobe, log, stone, bamboo. Southeast Asia, they use bamboo, and the wind can go through their houses really easy and keep their houses cool. So depending on the climate you live in and the type of materials you have on hand, it's amazing, really, what can be built naturally. Of course, we know the people in Mongolia use wool to insulate their yurts, their little round houses that they move because they're nomadic. And I know in Africa they use a lot of mud, They build with what they have on hand. And so I think that's something good to keep in mind when you're getting ready to build something. First think, what do I have on hand? What can I get locally? What can I get cheaply? What do I have on my property? We had a lot of stones. Of course, we're in Missouri. Of course, we had a lot of stones. But it just so happened that the property that we moved to actually had a huge pile of stones. A lot of them were about this big, small enough that we could carry easily, some bigger. But we used a lot of those in our foundation to save on cement. With a straw bale house, you have to have an extra wide foundation. It has to be the same width as the straw bale, so your straw bale can sit on it. So we didn't want to use a lot of extra concrete, so we put a lot of stones in there, and that saved us a lot of money. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of straw bale building, because it's actually a fairly new type of building in comparison with a lot of the other natural materials. And it began not too long after 1862, when the Homestead Act was passed by President Lincoln during the Civil War, when people were offered 160 acres of free land for just simply living on the land for 5 years, farming at least 10 acres. I suppose it varied maybe, but that's, and they had to build a house. That was one of the requirements in order to get their free land. Usually when we think of these pioneers who went west or whatever, we think they all built log cabins, and a lot of them did. But not everybody, because not everybody had a lot of wood available. Some of them built shanties, little wood structures. But what about those who moved to the Great Plains, especially Nebraska and Kansas, where there weren't hardly any trees? What were they going to build out of? A lot of times they did dugouts, but they still had to build with a little bit of something, right? Well, those who were on the grasslands, what did they have available? They had sod, they had grass, and they had soil. And so they looked for the grass that had the really thick, dense roots, like Indian grass and wheatgrass and buffalo grass, and that's what they built with. They literally took the sod off the top of the soil. Not real good for the environment, but it's what they had at the moment, and it was about the only way they could get their free land, right? So that's what they built with, and they called it the soddy. Sometimes they would dig into the bank and have a dugout and have a little bit of sod. And sometimes they were freestanding. Now here is the only known two-story sod house. It actually lasted till the 1960s. I thought that was pretty neat. But there's a certain part of Nebraska where they couldn't build out of sod. The Nebraska Sandhills. Too sandy. I actually spent some time there in my childhood, and we loved going down the sand dunes. But I can tell you, it wouldn't work to make a sod house. Well, thankfully, around that time, actually in the 1850s and widespread by the 1890s, was the hay baler, the mechanical hay baler. And so people started baling up prairie grasses, and then later on they used straw. And they figured out that it was much easier to build a straw bale house than a sod house, and a lot better for the land too. And so between 1896 and 1945, many straw bale buildings, including houses, farm buildings, churches, schools, offices, and grocery stores, were built in the Nebraska Sandhills. And they don't know for sure, but they think that they may have started plastering these straw bale houses after an incident occurred where one of the houses was eaten by some cows. So I think they figured out at some point that it was a good idea to put plaster on the outside. And so they had to come up with some kind of mud, but it wouldn't have taken near as much as it would have taken for a sod house. So now after more than 100 years, there's still over 2,000 surviving bale buildings in just 2 Nebraska counties in the Sandhills. The Sandhills isn't a huge area, but they did build a lot of straw bale buildings there. And this is, the oldest one that's surviving was built in 1903, but I couldn't find a picture of it. So this one was built in 1928, still in good condition. A lot of people think that, straw bale isn't very long lasting and that it molds easily and all that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but if it's built properly and it's maintained properly, it can last a long time. Okay? They did. They used mud on it. That's right, fella. All right. Well, in the 1940s and the 1950s, conventional building materials became more commonly available. Fiberglass insulation was actually introduced in 1938, and not long after that, drywall was introduced. And so it kind of fell out of fashion to use the available materials that people had, and straw bale building became largely unknown for a long period of time. In the 1960s, with perhaps you're familiar with Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called Silent Spring on DDT, the chemical that was being used, and the terrible effects it was having on the environment. That was the beginning of the environmental movement in America. And this beginning was actually a little bit of a beginning for the sustainability movement as well. Okay? So in the 1970s, there was an energy crisis where basically there was an embargo placed on oil from the Middle East. And so people started realizing, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should be reserving the non-renewable resources that we have. So in the 70s, that was another impetus towards the sustainable building movement, because people began to realize we need to start paying attention to how we're building. Because remember, if you build in such a way that you have to use a lot of electricity or gas or whatever to heat your building, then it's not as good for the environment. It's not as good for your pocketbook either, right? People started realizing this in the 1970s, okay? And in the 1980s, by then the buildings were started to be built more tightly so that there wasn't as much air loss, because people were trying to save money on their heating bills. Well, the problem is there was so much toxins in the building materials that when they started building their houses more tightly, people started getting sick. So they called that the sick building syndrome. It was actually quite, in the 1980s, it became pretty widespread, especially in office buildings. It seemed like there was a lot of people complaining about headaches and dizziness and all sorts of different strange symptoms. They didn't know what it was for a while, and they finally figured out it was a combination of the toxins in the building materials and the lack of ventilation in the buildings. So anyway, these three things in the 1990s, now people started realizing, okay, we really need to pay attention to the environment when we build, to our energy use, right? And also to the healthfulness of the products that we use to build with. And so then in the 1990s, quite a few organizations came together to start really promoting natural building and sustainable building. Like we have LEED certification today, LEED, that businesses, if they meet certain standards, they can get the LEED certification. And then there's probably some kind of government, help for people that use, better materials. All right, I'm going to show you just a few Strawbale buildings. Now, this one I don't know if it's Strawbale or cob, because cob is also one of the natural building methods, but cob and Strawbale can look a lot alike, okay? So,
explain what cob is?
we're going to talk about cob later, so I'm not going to explain it right now, but it's often used for small, really creative looking houses. This is probably the most creative one I put on here, but there's some really interesting ones on the internet. But Strawbale can lend itself both to small and creative, or it can lend itself to large and more conventional looking, kind of rectangular like we're doing, because it's a block, so it's easy to do it more of a square look. But you can actually bend bales and make them kind of roundy and do round houses as well. So anyway, here's one. This is probably in England, I'm not sure, but Strawbale building, natural building, sustainable building is very common in Europe, probably more so than in the US, but it's becoming more and more popular here as well. So here's a few that are more of a conventional look to give you an idea of some of the styles that people build with. This is Brian putting some straw bales in the wall. And there's our house, which you already saw. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the advantages of straw bale building. We're going to talk about more than straw bale building, but right now we're going to cover this. First of all, they've determined that the insulation value of straw bale is 30 to 35, R30 to 35, which is really good insulation. And that's actually the main reason why we chose to build with straw bale. Of course, we wanted to do something natural, but most of the other natural methods, do not provide this kind of insulation value or even anywhere near it. And since we're going to be living off the grid, we needed something that wouldn't require air conditioning in the summer. That's the main thing for me. I do not want to have to swelter. Yes?
Let me throw out something. When you're determining what type of material, it's a really good thing to consider the climate. Because some of these work really well in dry, arid climates, and some of them work.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The cob I was mentioning a while ago, it doesn't have good insulation value, but it works fine in hot, dry climates. Okay, like for instance, they use adobe, out in New Mexico. Well, adobe and cob are about the same thing, and we'll cover that later. The insulation value of straw bale, very amazing, and it's amazing. If you try to put R30 in your walls, that's really, really expensive compared to, straw bales. I think it cost us $700 for all the straw bales for our house, which is far less than it would cost for R30 in a house, I can tell you that. But we also didn't have to buy the siding and all the other drywall, and so anyway, it's a lot cheaper way to go if you want really good insulation. Also, straw bale has very good soundproofing qualities. Brian actually built a little straw bale room inside of our house as his office so that he can do sound recordings in there. So they use it actually quite commonly for sound studios. Now here we don't have earthquakes, right? Not that I know of, maybe occasionally, but maybe we do. All right, but they have found that straw bale buildings are earthquake proof. Okay, earthquake resistant, whatever. I guess anything could knock a building down if it was big and strong enough, right? But they've actually done some tests with straw bale. In March of 2009, they did shake table simulations of a straw bale house. It was Network for Earthquake Engineering Simulation Facility at the University of Nevada, Reno, in Reno, Nevada. That's backwards. With support from the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. And they provided convincing evidence that the construction system is very earthquake resistant. And you can see here they subjected it to a series of 8 earthquakes of increasing intensity, and it withstood accelerations of larger than the Kashmir earthquake. That was in Pakistan. I forget what year it was. 2005 or something, I'm not sure. Anyway, so now they're actually using strawbale construction in earthquake-prone countries like Pakistan, Mongolia, and China in order to try to save people's lives. Because even though if it's a really, huge earthquake, it might destroy the building, but it doesn't collapse like other houses do. And so some of these earthquakes, it just kills thousands of people, So they're trying to make this type of building more common in those countries in order to save people in case of earthquakes. Also, believe it or not, strawbale building is actually considered fireproof. In Australia, where they have a lot of wildfires, bushfires, they've started using strawbale very commonly over there. In this 2-hour fire rating test, they had a strawbale wall, and they subjected it to a blast of fire that went parallel. Didn't go direct onto the wall, it went parallel, okay? It was, like it says, 1,700 degrees for 2 hours. And it took 15 to 20 minutes before the plaster cracked, charred the surface of the straw, but it protected the deeper parts of the bales. The fire did not go all the way through. And when they stopped the test after the 2 hours, then they blasted it with a fire hose, strong pressure, and the spray of water didn't go through to the other side. That's one of the requirements for it to pass the test, and it passed it. It did not go through to the other side. And so when they went over to the other side that hadn't been burnt and they pulled the straw out, it was just like fresh straw. It was pretty amazing. Anyway, a lot of people think, because obviously we know that straw burns well, but when it's packed into a bale, it's very dense, so there's hardly any oxygen in it, and that's why it performs that way. And of course, with the addition of the plaster, makes it really safe. So, and it's nothing. Of course, just to clarify, we don't build our houses out of hay bales. We build them out of straw bales. Sometimes people get that confused. Big difference. Straw is, when they harvest it, it's dry and it's dead material. It's not green at all.
Without the seed, mostly.
And without the seed. When they harvest hay, it's usually green, has seed in it, and oftentimes still a little bit on the wet side. And that's why sometimes when a farmer stores his hay bales in his barn, if it was too wet when he put it in, it can, what we call, spontaneously combust and burn the hay barn down. That does happen sometimes. Doesn't happen with straw, though. Straw is a completely different thing. So, just to clarify. All right. So here's the question we get asked a lot. But doesn't the straw rot? How do you keep it from rotting, right? Well, of course, if it's subjected to water, if you don't build a proper roof and your roof leaks on it for a period of time and you don't know about it, you're going to have a problem, just like any other kind of building, right? Okay, so one thing I will say is the one climate where straw bale building is not recommended is in a tropical climate where it's humid and really moist in the air for the entire year and it never dries out. Because the straw bales, they don't rot unless they get over a certain moisture level for an extended period of time. So as long as you have at least one dry season during the year where those bales can dry out, then it's fine, So it's okay, to have a humid season as well. That's no problem. So this area, actually there's quite a few straw bale buildings in this area, but it's considered a perfectly fine area. And so first of all, we're going to talk about how to prevent your straw from rotting, okay? First of all, you need big boots, a good foundation. They suggest that you raise your straw bales at least a foot off the ground. And of course, if you're in a floodplain, you'd want to raise it higher. But also, you need to waterproof the top of your foundation. And then they have you we actually just used logs because we were trying to use whatever we could naturally off our land. So we put two small logs on top of our foundation, and then we insulated with wool in between, okay? and then we put the straw bales on top of those. So that way there's no way that the moisture from the ground coming up through the foundation can touch the straw bales. It's fully off. So the big boot concept is actually, in my opinion, important for any kind of building, because I've seen all sorts of buildings built in the olden days where people didn't pay attention to what they were doing, and the buildings are sitting down on the ground and they're all moldy. Doesn't matter what it's made out of. If it stays wet, it's going to mold, right? Unless it's like stone or something, but
Even stuff treated with high levels of chemical, like your normal insulation, will mold. And I've seen sheetrock mold.
Yeah, the paper on
Nobody ever
sheetrock
asks
is what
why do you
molds.
build out of that? It's going to mold, so
Yeah.
funny.
So that's one of the things. And another thing is big hat. Make sure your building wears a big hat. Large overhangs. Some people don't want to put large overhangs, and so instead you got to have some overhang. But if you don't want a large overhang, then you're going to use a different kind of plaster. Okay, so we're going to talk about plasters in a minute. But we personally like a large overhang. We actually put more like porch roofs all the way around because it's very convenient. And I'm telling you, when you're building a house like this and it takes you a while to build it, it's really nice to have a dry place. So we're really happy that we did build the porch roofs all the way around. It's made it a lot easier for the building. And then the well-chosen jacket, and that has to do with the plastering. And we're going to talk about what the plaster is made out of and all that in a minute. But first of all, the main thing you need to know about plastering that a lot of people are not aware of is that whenever you build with something natural and you're going to put a plaster on the outside of it, don't use cement. Cement stucco is never appropriate for natural building. Instead, we use clay plaster or lime plaster, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the properties of the plasters are actually quite different. Cement stucco tends to bring moisture in, it wicks it and wicks it into the bales. And yet, it kind of sounds funny. In another sense, though, it's not as vapor permeable. You know what vapor permeable is? Usually people call it breathable. Well, it's not really breathable. That's just what we call it. It just really means that if there's moisture in the air, it can move past it easy, move into it and through it easily. That's what vapor permeable means. And so cement stucco is not very vapor permeable. So if you get moisture inside of your bale, it doesn't let the moisture out very well. Okay? Lime plaster is sort of medium on vapor permeable, and it is acceptable for straw bale building. Like we said, if you don't want to do a large overhang, you can use the lime plaster. But it's okay, but it's not as good as clay as far as the vapor permeability of it. Clay is extremely vapor permeable. It lets moisture pass in and out constantly, and that's what you want when you're doing natural building. Any kind of natural materials, especially straw bale. Very important that the moisture can pass out of it because, it's going to get in. We know that moisture gets into walls. That's just what happens. So you want to be able to let it out. Okay, so clay is the best. Clay is actually hygroscopic, and that means it tends to hold on to water. So if you do get water on your straw bale wall and it hits the plaster, the clay actually holds on to that water instead of moving the water into the straw bale. It likes water more than straw does, okay? As opposed to cement. Cement doesn't like water as much as the straw does. So if you get water on your cement, it's going to go straight into the straw, okay? Now lime plaster is sort of in between the two, okay? So it's appropriate for straw bale. It's not actually as good as clay, but if you need to use it, it's fine, okay? So choose your jacket well. If you're going to have driving rain on your wall, use lime plaster. And of course, obviously, when you're using natural plasters, you're going to have to maintain them. Usually they say once a year, go and look for any kind of cracks and fix them. Not that big of a deal, okay? But if you have driving rain on your wall and you use clay plaster, And it's not going to last a year, you know, because clay is just clay, and it's going to get soft and it's going to break off, and you know. So if you use your large overhangs, it's no big deal. We do not get any kind of driving rain on our walls because we have our smallest porch roof is 4 foot wide, 4 foot out, and so we haven't had any kind of problems, even with unplastered straw bales. And so you can actually leave your straw bales unplastered. We've left ours unplastered for a year, and they're no worse for the wear. Didn't bother them a bit. Okay, so any questions up to this point about straw rotting or anything else before we move on?
Well, the concept I hear all the time is, well, straw bale's fine for a dry climate, but here it's going to mold because people see straw molding all the time.
Yeah, because they don't realize.
Not just rotting, but they're more worried about
Molding.
molds.
Yeah. Well, when do they see it molding? Like, you mean if it's left out in the
Well, you go buy
elements,
some
you mean?
bales and you tear them open and there's mold in there.
Okay, well, I guess probably it got rained on at some point.
It's secondhand straw that's been left out, or there's some impurities that got hay in there.
Yeah.
And as a landscaper, I know from working with good bales, when you buy them from the farmer right after they're harvested dry, you will not see that.
Yeah, you have to be careful when you purchase your straw bales to make sure that the farmer didn't leave the straw bales out in the field and let them get rained on first. You have to be very careful when you choose who you're going to buy from and make sure that you get good dry. And you can tell, you know, if they're bright and clean looking, they're fine. There are moisture meters that you can buy if you really want to check the moisture percentage, and you can look online. I think it has to be less than 20% moisture level in order for it to not decay, you know.
However, there's another point, and that is that mold cannot live without a sustainable amount of water. If you build your straw bale right, even if you stuck a moldy bale in there, that mold will die.
Yeah,
it
it
can't
would die.
live. So people have this idea that mold can just grow. Once it's there, it can grow.
Right.
It's false. Absolutely false. Mold has to have the right condition to grow. And so you're not going to get mold in your wall by putting moldy bale in.
Right.
Unless there's enough moisture and you haven't built it right.
Yeah. So, okay. Any other questions or before I move on? Okay, Teresa.
I'm just wondering how you store your bales until you're ready to build.
Okay. Well, what we did, and this is probably typical most of the time, is we went ahead and built the frame and the roof, and then we bought the bales and stuck them inside the house, and then from the inside of the house we put them around. Now there's another type of straw bale building which we're going to talk a little bit about, but it's where they don't actually have a frame at all. They just literally build with the straw bales. It's called load bearing. That's actually how they did it in the sandhills of Nebraska. And obviously you can't build the roof if you don't have a frame, right? So in those cases, it's more tricky. I mean, they have to make sure they're working in a dry season, they have to cover their bales, and they have to get it up quick, and then get that roof on there quickly. So, you know, in my opinion, if you're building a small house, load bearing can work fine, you know, because you can do it quickly and because you're not worrying so much about, okay, is this really safe, you know. And there's, you know, they have guidelines for what load bearing can handle. It can't handle a big house nearly as easily. But anyway, anything else? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about framing options. Like I said, the load bearing doesn't have any frame. They literally just build it with the bales, and then they compress the bales before they put the roof on. Straw bale building can use any kind of framing option. We chose post and beam because we were trying to use the wood off the land, but people actually more commonly use stick frame just because most people don't have wood to build with. So what they do is they simply space their 2x4s or whatever they're going to use the width of a straw bale. So they space it out, and then they can just stick those straw bales in there when they get ready to do it. That's the most common way. Balloon framing, I really don't know much about that. I know it exists, and I've looked at it a little bit, but I couldn't even tell you what it is. But people use every type of framing option for straw bale building. How long does it take? Brian already talked a little bit about this. It doesn't have to take forever like it seems to be taking for us. But I will say this, I would much rather wait, because I've had people say to me, oh, you're so patient, I can never wait that long. Well, the fact is, I've had a mortgage on a house before, and it was extremely stressful for me. I would much rather wait 3.5 years or however long to build a house and be debt-free than to move in right away and have a mortgage for the next 30 years. Okay? So as far as waiting, even if it takes me a long time, I'd still rather do it that way. Okay? But it doesn't have to take that long.
No, you can do it in a year, easily.
Yeah,
easily.
I mean, it's going to vary on
Even
the
less.
size of house you build. You know, a lot of people in the natural building movement are building very small houses, and I suppose that depends on how big your family is and how squished you want to be. We've lived in pretty small houses for quite a while, and I was ready for a big house, so I said, let's build a big house. Sometimes I might regret it because it seems to take us forever, right? But when we get in, I'll be happy. So that, of course, it depends on the size, it depends on the framing method, you know. Stick frame, if you know how to do that and you can do it really quick, that's going to make it go a lot faster, of course, you know. We have been clearing the land at the same time, and post and beam tends to take a lot of, you know, manpower, and since we only have one man with manpower, well, we got some boys, they have a little bit of manpower, but, you know, so if you don't have a strong man to do it, you might want to go with the stick frame method because it's easy to...
Strong isn't the point, healthy.
Okay, strong and healthy.
Strong men hurt their backs because they're not healthy.
That's true.
So, or they're not wise. One or the
So
other.
choose your framing method carefully.
To have a good health practice is essential.
Yeah, yeah. But also, obviously, how many people you have working on it, how much time they're able to invest in it. You know, there's lots of different variables on how long it's going to take. So don't think that just because we're taking 3.5 years that every Strawbale house takes 3.5 years, because it just isn't true. There's so many variables. You have to decide what's right for you and what you can handle and all of that, you know.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is, something I discovered was, you know, people always tell me don't use green wood. That's only partially true in certain contexts. Clearing took me so long that a lot of the wood was drying just on the ground. And I was using cedar, which is the type of wood is also important. But when you build like this, and this is our house, and I was even using logs flattened on top in the sawmill, but for our flooring, our upper flooring, you see that? It has a long time to sit there without being heated. If you take green logs and you put them in a building and lock it all up and seal it all up and start heating it right away, what's going to happen? That wood's going to dry too fast, it's going to warp and twist. And so it dawned on me, I'm not having that problem. Most of it's been built by green wood, but it's taken so long to build that it's been allowed to dry in natural air conditions, and now it's pretty dry, and when we seal it in, we won't have the problem. So that's, you know, just another advantage to building this way.
Yeah, yeah. And the nice thing is, having taken this long, we've been able to do it without any debt. If we were going to try to build it in 6 months or a year, we would have had to take out a loan. Even though it didn't cost us all that much, we still would have had to take out a loan to do it.
And that's with one wage earner working 20 hours a week. Because 26 hours a week I work on a house, 26 hours I work at my job, and I'm not making very much, but we've been able to do it. So.
And we do have free rent, so that helps.
Yeah, we have a place.
We live in a little place that
tiny
belongs to my mom.
You got to be willing to sacrifice and give up some of the unnecessary luxuries of American living.
Yeah. And then there's always the question, how much does it cost? And obviously that's going to vary too. But just to give you some ideas, first of all, before I think about how much it's going to cost for me to build something, I want to think about how much is it going to cost for me to heat and cool it through the lifetime of the house, because that is actually oftentimes more expensive than just building the house to begin with. And that's one of the reasons that obviously that we chose the Strawbale, because we can heat and cool it for very little and saves us a lot of money in the long run, okay? Obviously the size of the house, it's going to make, you know, all the difference, and how much of the work you do yourself. Obviously you don't have to be trained in building or anything. We didn't really know how to build before we did this. I did a lot of research and he did a lot of grunt work.
Common
but
sense
we work
goes a long way.
together. Yeah, but there's a lot of information on the internet. Not just Strawbale built, not just the Strawbale, that's just the walls, you know. I mean, you got the roof, and you know, if you don't know what you're doing, just look it up on the internet, and if you do enough research, you might actually find some really good information. But, you know, if you have to hire out a lot of it, obviously it's going to cost more. We've not hired anything out. We're doing it all ourselves, even though we have to research before we do it and all of that. We can't afford to hire it out. And besides, I think it's really good education for the kids, you know. So
A lot of
it's
people in the
free
cities
education.
will be paying more to exercise per month than I'm paying. I'm exercising and getting a free building, while they're paying
Yeah.
fees to exercise and then having to deal with a lot of trash
Yeah.
before their eyes, basically. I mean, you know, the TV, watching the TV and other things I won't mention, but yeah.
Yeah. Another thing is a lot of people who do natural building, they find a lot of building materials salvaged, you know, so that they don't have to pay as much and buy as much new. Yes?
I see you got the whole idea of cost.
Uh-huh.
Did you design your house so it could be heated with a certain type of heating based on what you were going to build?
I guess you could say that. The fact that it's Strawbale, we knew we weren't going to need a huge heating system, and we do plan to heat with wood. And we're going to talk actually about, right now we just have a little wood stove. We're going to be building a different type of heater eventually, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit.
A wood burning heater is more efficient.
Another type of wood burning heater, yeah. But some people do, of course, the radiant floor heating and stuff like that, and that's a good thing. We didn't even feel that was really necessary for our situation because Strawbale is so efficient that, you know, the amount of money that it takes to put in a radiant floor heater is sort of, well, is it worth it? Because it doesn't take that much to heat a Strawbale house, you know.
Yeah, a stove almost.
Plus, it's actually kind of expensive to do radiant floor heating. Some of the things, you know, when we were kind of trying to figure out how much it was going to cost or whatever, you don't just think about the material cost. You have to think about, obviously, the tools that you're going to need, you know. That's a big part of it. So when I think about how much it has cost us, I don't really factor in the tools very much because they're tools that we need anyway. Except we did spend $5,000 on a bandsaw, sawmill, and so that was a big expense, a huge expense for us. Probably was about a third of the cost of our house. But it has saved us from having to buy, you know, we did our loft floors. He milled that up, and interior walls, and he used it, of course, for the posts and beams some too. So we've saved a lot of money, and when we're all done, we'll have all these tools too. So we're not losing anything, and we can sell them if we need to.
I was also looking at the value of learning to work with wood, beautiful woods on your property. It's part of your property. You could say, you know, this post came from over there, and this black walnut here came from that tree. It's just, aesthetically, it's really great. And also I wanted my boys to experience, we have no value on things. We go to the store, we give them some of this paper stuff, they give us this thing. We don't identify the beauty of the way God grew it, the beauty of the grain, and a lot of these things, and choosing the right tree, and you know. So aesthetically, it was a huge difference to me.
Yeah.
I want to be able to continue to build for years to come, build sheds and barns, and I have built other structures on the property. Because I have the bandsaw, I can continue to do that for about, I'd say, a 1/16 of the cost a normal person's going to pay for the hardware store to build a shed. I can do it myself.
Yeah, and by buying the sawmill, we would have spent all that in, you know, lumber and everything anyway, or more, and we get to end up and have the sawmill when we're done, and you know, continue to use it. So we did end up buying our rafters for our roof because we really didn't have that much lumber. You know, we did 2x12 rafters because we did a cathedral ceiling, so that would have been a lot more wood to try to, you know.
I didn't have trees that big.
He didn't have trees, yeah. So we went ahead and bought that. But the roofing assembly was our most expensive part, of course, because it was conventional. We did metal roofing, and I know a lot of you are builders and you know all this already, but I noticed that in these here parts, a lot of people who build, Sonia didn't like that. I noticed that here in Missouri, a lot of people who build with metal roofing do not put waterproofing under it. And from all the research I've done, it's a really good idea to put waterproofing under your metal so that when the water condenses on the metal, it doesn't drip into your insulation. So we did do
They won't
that.
build with straw because they're worried about mold.
Yeah, exactly. So my grandpa actually had that problem. He built a building in Illinois and put metal siding on and didn't put any waterproofing layer. And so, yeah, in that case it was house wrap he didn't put on. So yeah, the water condensed and then rotted out the insulation. So anyway, that's one thing that we did make sure we did do. And then we also have used attic foil, the silver stuff that reflects the radiant heat back in. So what we're trying to do with the roofing assembly is make it at least almost as efficient as the wall assembly, because our roof is probably at least as much square footage as our walls are. But it's much more difficult to do natural building for a roof because, well, it doesn't work so well to make a roof out of straw bales. And I actually did a lot of research on insulating naturally, and there's not any really great options like there is for the walls. There really isn't. We tried wool. I bought a huge pile of wool from a sheep shearer because wool is the absolute #1 insulator. It's just awesome. I mean, it's fire resistant. It's not bothered by moisture because it continues to insulate even if it gets wet, and then it'll dry out again without rotting. It's awesome stuff. One problem. We stuffed it into the cavities, and it didn't go nearly as far as it should have. Because, you know, they sell wool insulation nowadays, and that stuff's expensive. No way we could afford it. So we thought we'd try our own. But the stuff that you buy pre-processed, it's clean and chopped into little tiny pieces, and you blow it in, just like you would any kind of blow-in insulation. It's great. Yeah. Anyway, ours, we couldn't blow it in. It was in, it was, fleeces that were, we bought, it was cheaper because it was the stuff that was seconds, But anyway, it didn't go very far, so we're like, okay, we're not doing that again. It was not very nice, but it was an experiment, and I did all sorts of research on using wool for insulation and found out, yeah, it's great stuff, but nobody seems to have tried it, at least nobody that's put it on the internet. Really tried it for a big house. Few people have tried it for small houses. So I wanted to experiment and try it. And even though it was not a very fun experience, I'm glad I did it because now I can share with the natural building community and tell them what our issues were. And if somebody wants to try a different way, more power to them, but at least they know what the issues are. We had to end up stuffing it more densely because it wasn't filling in the holes because it wasn't the right, it wasn't into little pieces. Anyway, so we ended up scrapping that idea, and we're going to go with cellulose insulation that doesn't have ammonia in it. Most that you buy at regular building stores has ammonia, and we're trying to stay away from any kind of off-gassing chemicals. But there's a place in Springfield that does sell it without the ammonia. It just has the borates in it to keep the bugs and the mice away. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of the house. Yes?
It has what in it to keep the bugs?
Borates, like borax. Yeah, that's what they put in pretty much any kind of natural insulation or whatever, because it's considered, healthy. It doesn't off-gas like chemicals. It's a natural product, but it keeps away the bugs and the mice or whatever. So that's what we're going to be using. We haven't done that yet. But another thing is we chose the color white for our roof, which maybe not everybody likes white, but I didn't have any particular color preference, and so I looked up which color is the best for reflecting heat, and white was the color. So I said, hey, reflecting heat, I'm all about that. I'm trying to keep my house cool, and I actually like the white. So anyway, and because we're doing a cathedral ceiling, we only have the depth of the rafters, so that's why we did the 2x12s. But I would have actually probably done even more insulation if we weren't doing that. But
there is one other thing about wool I'd say that as a substitute for one of the most toxic materials
Oh,
we use
yeah,
is
that's
spray
right.
foam. And it's so easy and quick, like everything else in our society that's easy and quick, there's usually a downside.
For the little tiny
Spray
holes.
foam, the propellants in it are extremely toxic. I wouldn't have it in my house.
Yeah.
But, you know, it off-gases far more than any of the other foams, right?
Yeah.
But wool can be used just like spray foam. You stick it in and it's got a springiness to it so it fills out to a certain extent. You can pack it in a little sliver with a screwdriver head or a knife and get it in there, like between your window gaps.
Yeah. So our wool experiment was not for naught.
No.
It was actually a good thing because this is something new that I've never heard anybody say. So this is something that we can share with the natural building community. It's really awesome for those little tiny holes. We also used it for a few walls, like the loft walls that don't have straw bale in them. We used this, you know, and it's fine for filling cavities. It's awesome for filling cavities. It just wasn't great for, in the ceiling, we just had some mesh up, and so we couldn't get it in there correctly.
Then it's compacted.
Yeah,
That's the
it
problem.
got
You
too
have to have a
compacted.
machine to
So, I mean,
block
it'll
it.
work,
Yeah.
but it only did 1/6 of the house, which wasn't nearly enough.
Well, we
So-
did the end walls as well with it. We actually insulated
That's
walls
true,
with it.
yeah. So, anyway, now I want to tell you a little bit about the ingredients, the main ingredients in natural building is sand, clay, and straw. Okay? Now, it took me a while to figure out that the sand that you use is generally not the sand that you buy from the building store. That stuff is kind of like beach sand, you know, it's round and smooth, sort of. Well, you're actually, especially for plastering where you're putting it on a wall and you really want it to stick, it's very important to use river sand. It's sharp. Okay, it's not going to cut you, but it feels sharp and it's gritty, and there's a lot of different sizes, you know, in the sand. And so it's widely available from some of these companies who go out, you know, they go out and do cement, you know, pour your cement and stuff. They get their own sand. They don't buy it from the building store either. They get their own sand from the rivers, and they'll bring you out a big dump truck load of it for, I think about $300. And so that's the kind you want to use for natural building, except for the very finished layer, the last layer of plaster, you want to use the smaller sand because it's easier to get a smooth finish, you know. Cob, adobe, earthen plaster, or render is another word for it. It's all the same stuff. It's all sand, clay, and straw. It's just in different proportions depending on what you're making, okay? So we talked a little bit about, I used the word cob earlier. The word cob actually means a lump in Old English. In England, they built cob houses. That's one of their ancient ways of building. And so they basically just take lumps of this sand, clay, and straw mix, and they just build with it, okay? So now the adobe, it means a brick, okay? So it's the same stuff. They just make bricks out of it and dry it, and that's what they do, like in South America or whatever, you know, New Mexico. Earthen plaster. The word render is used for the outside of a building. The word plaster is used for the inside of a building. Don't ask me why. We just use the word plaster. But if you hear the word render, it just means plaster on the outside of a building. Okay? Now, light clay straw is actually a German type of natural building, and it's basically you take the clay. Now, when I say clay here, I'm referring to clay that has already been mixed into water to a kind of a thick chocolate milk consistency. Okay? They call it slip, clay slip. You know, people that do pottery use clay slip. It's pretty common.
Like a glue.
Yeah, so the light clay straw is where you take the straw and you dip it in the slip and mix it all around really well, and you have this gooey mess of straw, and it's awesome for filling holes. That's what you do on your walls after you put the straw bales up. You know, there's inconsistencies in the bales. You stuff the straw into the any kind of holes. The light clay straw, it's been mixed in the slip, and it'll stick that way. And it also, you know, kind of compacts easier. You can't really compact springy straw very well, but once it has the slip in there, it can compact. Anyway, that's how you patch any kind of holes that you have in your walls before you plaster it. And we also we did it in other areas too that needed it. You can actually build a whole wall out of light clay strip.
Some
Slip.
people
Light
do that.
clay
They
straw.
pack it in
I get all
They
confused by
use
these
forms
words.
and they pack it in.
Yeah, that's actually another
so-
method of
You see,
building.
that proves the fact though, well, isn't it going to mold? It may start to must a little bit, but once that clay gets dry, it wicks all that water out, it kills anything that was in there. Clay will continue to do that. Clay will continue to sort of sterilize that in a sense by getting water out and not allowing water to stay
Yeah.
if it's a normal atmospheric condition,
Yeah.
except for the tropics.
And when you use light clay straw, your walls sprout. It's pretty cool looking.
Grow grass
They grow the grass.
at first.
And when the grass dies, then you know it's dry inside. So it's a moisture monitor. It's not inside the straw bale. It's just in those little, pockets.
I did learn how to go up vertical surfaces with straw bale by putting nails in the wood and making ropes out of it.
With light
And
clay
just
straw.
Building in
Yeah.
layers, like a layer of coiled pot layer.
Yeah,
And I
'cause we
could
have a
go
little
straight up a
piece we
vertical
need to
wall
patch.
around the log that way. It was really neat.
Yeah. So
This is something I learned.
So those are the main ingredients in natural building. One other ingredient that you should know about is lime putty. It is type S lime that you use, hydrated lime. There's another type of lime that you can use as well that I'm not familiar with, but it's really expensive, so I'm not even going to bother mentioning it. But like I said, if you're not going to have large overhangs, use the lime. Now the lime putty is in place of the clay, so you still have to add the sand and the straw. Sand is actually your main building material in this mix. It's mostly sand, a little bit of the clay or the lime, and then a really little bit of the straw. That's just to help it not crack and stuff.
And the straw you trim off your walls, because you trim your walls with a weed eater before you plaster it.
Yeah.
It's used
So it's not too firm.
We're using it in our floor because we're doing a special type of earthen floor, and we're using it in our plaster on the walls. So everything's getting reused.
Yeah, the chopped straw that came from the trimming is being used in the plaster and the floor. Yeah. So anyway, with the lime, you buy it in the bags, you mix it with water, you let it sit for at least a few days. We actually let ours sit for a year, and it actually is better the longer it sits. But it's okay for it to freeze. You just have to mix it again with the big mixer thing
Drill,
on your
the drill
drill,
in the mixer.
whatever that's called. And lime has a chemical set like concrete does. It's not like clay. Clay doesn't have any chemical set. It only hardens. So with clay, if it hardens and you get it wet, it's going to get soft again. With lime and concrete, once you get it wet. Now lime is a little not as hard as concrete, okay? So it can crack a little bit more and stuff if it gets continually wet. But it's pretty good. So it's also a little bit caustic, kind of like concrete. So originally we were going to use it on the outside of our walls, and then I'm like, oh, I really don't want to have to do that because what a pain. It's just hard to mess because you got to wear gloves to touch it and all that. And so we ended up using the plaster when we decided the clay plaster when we decided to put the overhangs on. So then we had 5 big barrels of lime putty sitting there with nothing to do. So we ended up using it in our floor, which I'll talk about. Another thing is the thermal mass walls, like Jim was mentioning, is basically when you take the cob, okay, some people build houses out of cob, but it's terrible insulation. But it's awesome for putting in interior walls because what it does is it stores any kind of heat, whether, like for instance, in the wintertime, if you heat with wood or whatever, the heat will go into your thermal mass walls and be stored there, and then it'll radiate it out during the night to keep your house warm in the night, okay? Now in the summertime, any heat that comes into your house during the day, it'll store it, and that's a good thing too because it helps keep your house cool during the day, and then it'll radiate it out during the night. So thermal mass walls are awesome for putting inside of the house, but if you're in this climate, please don't use it as your exterior walls because it's got terrible insulation value. And there was actually a guy in northern Missouri who thought, well, you know, he knew it didn't have a good insulation value, but he built one anyway because it was so cheap. Well, he reported later on the website that he had built a Strawbale house too. He built both. And he reported later that it's really not a good idea for our climate because it's really cold. And furthermore, if it's too cold, you have condensation issues which can cause mold problems. So that's why you need the insulation jacket on the outside. Okay, but the thermal mass is great for inside. You don't have to do all your interior walls with it. We're just going to do probably 2 with ours.
It's probably the cheapest of all. They use it all over the world in non-spoiled cultures. Basically,
Yeah.
they just take the earth and make a simple form, ram it, move the form up.
Yeah,
ram
and
it.
that's the
It's
rammed
cheapest
earth.
of
There's
all.
cob,
It's not even
which you build in lumps, but the rammed
5%
earth,
cement, and the rest is basically your
the clay and the sand.
subsoil.
Yeah,
It can have rocks in it or anything. It really doesn't matter about the level. Any type of soil will work as long as it's subsoil. And you ram it in by hand is the best way. And 5%
and you can make different
cement
colors. I
powder.
don't know if you can see that.
And it's
sort of-
slightly moistened. You don't
Yeah.
make it like a slurry. It's slightly moistened.
Yeah, so this
I'm
is
excited
rammed
about
earth.
that.
Rammed earth and cob are similar, a little bit different, but another neat thing about having interior thermal mass walls is it absorbs the humidity that's in the air during the summer, so it kind of acts like an air conditioner. So that's one of the other reasons we want to do it, because it helps to keep your air feeling nice, more like an air conditioner would, you know. But
And it'll absorb, if it's in contact with a thermal mass floor, it'll take that cool up into the wall and give it off during the summer. Too.
right. I'm just going to mention a few other things really quickly. We're doing an earthen floor, and it's basically the same thing. It's cob, and it's great thermal mass and everything. You do the same layers like you would for a cement floor with waterproofing and gravel and all of that, and then you put your earthen floor layer on top instead of the cement. So that's what we're doing. We're actually doing limecrete for our first layer because we had so much lime, but this next layer will be earth, which is the same as cob and plaster, same recipe. One other thing, scoria is a volcanic rock, and it is an awesome insulator. So if you can ever get your hands on scoria, really awesome. It's kind of expensive to ship out here, but if you lived in Arizona or New Mexico or somewhere out there, really, really awesome. But it's a good way to insulate the floor because it's not like foam or something, you know. It's hard to find floor insulation. We did not insulate our floor. We just insulated the perimeter of the floor.
We do have sawdust and straw in our clay, which will have some insulation.
Yeah, we did put sawdust in, which is an insulator. This is a radiant floor heater. If you're going to do a radiant floor heater, please insulate underneath the floor. The rocket mass heater, probably a lot of you have heard of that already. That's what we're going to do for our heater. It's basically a barrel, and inside the barrel you have a sort of a smaller barrel, and well, I'll show you a picture here.
Well, there's two things are involved.
Here's a diagram to give you an idea how it does it.
Reburning your gases so that you're getting multiplied times heat out of what you normally get out of a piece of log. You don't even have to use big wood, use twigs like sticks.
You use sticks.
The other part is thermal mass again, so that you run your exhaust, loop it in this thermal mass made out of cob or sand or rocks, and so you burn the fire for about 2 hours and it heats the house for the rest of the day, because that has held onto that heat and just gives it off in a radiant fashion for hours. So usually you only need it twice a day, burn it for 2 hours. You use an eighth to the 16th of the amount of wood you would normally use with a regular wood stove to heat your house.
And the other thing is it reburns the smoke and everything until it's all burned up, and then it comes out as CO2. So you don't have any...
CO2 and moisture.
Yeah. So really quickly, there is a healthier option for water pipe. It's called polypropylene pipe, and aquatherm.com is one of the companies that carries it. So that's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to use PVC, which is not healthy. And even PEX pipe, there's some question about the health of that. So polypropylene is sort of the new wave of green pipe, right? All right. Just a couple things about a septic system idea that we are planning to do. In Australia, there's a company who does a dry septic system, okay? You use a regular flush toilet. It goes, gets piped to your septic system, but instead of being filled with water with the scum layer on top and the sludge on the bottom, and that sounds really gross to me, but that's the way they do septic systems, okay? And then goes out to your drainage field, right? That's I didn't know how septic systems work, so I was really excited to learn about this when I learned about it. But also I learned about why septic systems fail. We happen to live in an older house with an older septic system that is probably not sized for our family, so we know about septic systems that don't work so well. This is from the website of the Australian company, wormfarm.com.au is the website, and it gives an idea. You can just go there and look it up. We're going to do it a little bit differently than this, but the main gist of it is, okay, here's a box. Imagine this is cement, right? You see the two compartments? Imagine it's buried in the ground, okay? On one side, you put sawdust and worms. On the other side, you put nothing until you need it, okay? You pipe your effluent from your toilet. We're going to actually separate our gray water and our black water, just so that we don't have to do such a big system, okay? You pipe your stuff from your toilet into this, and it's underground, so it's, fine for the cold weather and everything. And the worms have a feast, okay? And so I think composting toilets are a great idea, except for the ick factor. And I don't like the ick factor, but I like this idea because it's outside of your house and you don't have to go carting it out or mess with flies in your house or anything like that, because it's just a regular flush toilet. And so after a while, if you feel like this one's getting full, and actually they say that they never really get full because the water, the liquid drains. You have a little drain system, and there's hardly really any solids. So, but eventually, if you want to refresh it, you can close this one off, put your sawdust and worms in the other one, and let this one compost for a year or whatever, and then you can take it out, and if you want to use it on your fruit trees or whatever, feel free. It's up to you. So it's a lot better than the sewage sludge they spread out on the fields without us knowing.
Now what about E. coli? Because people are going to ask about that.
Okay, hold on. Evelyn has a question.
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
There's a book called Humanure.
Humanure, that's right. I've read it.
They go over a system like
Yeah, I've never actually seen this particular one. Do they have the in-ground one in that book? They talk about it like having it in your house. And
I'm not finished with it, so I'm not
okay, yeah, I haven't heard them talk about the in-ground one. This is a new thing that I really haven't heard from in America. But anyway, just give you a basic idea. So,
And of course, the food you're eating in the grocery stores, they can legally spray.
Yeah, they put untreated manure, human manure on the fields. But this way, everything is filtered. It's processed by the worms, and then you can compost it in this until it's just nice and fluffy and it's not nasty. And then if you want to compost it for another year, whatever, it doesn't matter. I mean, you don't even have to use it on anything. At least it's, I think, a lot better than the traditional septic system. So anyway, I'm going to be done. Sorry, Ruthie.